Hello, friends. Today we are going to discuss from the book Moments, Chapter 10, the short story The Beggar by Anton Chekhov. My name is Dr. Amit Ranjan and I work with RIE Bhubaneswar. So let us start. So The Beggar by Anton Chekhov. Anton Chekhov, as you can see, 1860 to 1904, died very young, just at the age of 44. But great people do great things even at young age. So he's one of the most prolific playwrights and short story writer that the world has known. Despite the fact that he wrote in Russian, he's one of the most famous playwrights and short storytellers, even in the English language. He's been translated variously into many languages, including various Indian languages as well. All right, so the issue of beggar is something that we encounter, all of us, all the time, in front of religious places, on the roads, street lights. It's something that perplexes us, that moves us, that makes us sad. And Anton Chekhov has presented a different viewpoint about it. We'll also discuss other views by and by as we proceed with this chapter. So, I'd like to begin with an anecdote about myself. I also befriended a beggar in my life, very much like the protagonist Sergei of this story. And so, this man's name was Ivan Dyer, and it's very interesting that in India you would see a beggar who speaks English, and that is what perplexed me. He called me from behind, saying, "I'm a beggar, not a hustler," and I was surprised. Very few people use the word hustler in this country. So I befriended him, helped him, tried to reform him, but unlike the story that we are going to do, I wasn't quite able to. This is also Ivan Dyer's picture. Pictures have been taken by photographer Arijit Sen. So let's look at these words that are used for beggar. So there are various words in our regional languages as well, and in English as well. So there's beggar, hustler, destitute, mendicant, tramp, various words with different kinds of meanings. And we should understand the nuances, the differences between words. We should be sensitive to language. So we'll go through all these synonyms and see what they mean and what a beggar actually is. So a beggar, as we understand it, is somebody who does not have the means to subsist, the means to live, and therefore they ask for alms. The origins of the idea of beggary, whether in European culture or in Indian culture, is religious. As you also know well, that there were Bodh bhikshus or Jain bhikshus or even Hindu bhikshus. So these are religious in that they are dedicated to the service of God and they do not have a means of livelihood, therefore they ask for money. That is one connotation. And the other connotation is where a person becomes extremely poor, does not have a means to subsist. So the word beggar itself, it has its origins in a proper noun. So proper noun is a name. So Father Begwin was a monk in one of the churches in Europe, and he started a movement whereby the female monks started asking for alms to be able to spend time in prayer rather than worry about their livelihood. This died out, and then the male monks took up this order, and so it's very interesting that it comes from a person's name. Think about it. Do you know other words that have origins in proper nouns? I'll give you an example. The word juggernaut, if you have heard it, Juggernaut, juggernaut. The word juggernaut means something that is heavy, difficult to move, like bureaucracy or any project that is garangutan, that is humongous. That word comes from nothing but Jagannath, Lord Jagannath of Puri. So the English could not pronounce the word Jagannath, so they made it Juggernaut. And it directly pertains to the Rath Yatra, which just concluded yesterday, because the Rath has to be moved by thousands and lakhs of people. And similarly, juggernaut means anything which is difficult to move, which requires humongous effort. So that's a fun fact. Hustler is a word which could mean a thief, a drug peddler, or the new interpretations of it, street musicians who sing on the street, play an instrument on the street, and people would come and give money in appreciation of their art. So you see there are such wildly varying meanings of the same word, but they all have their origin in the same idea of transaction. Destitute. Destitute is somebody who's reduced to bare minimum, who just does not have any means to live, who does not even cannot afford to eat. Mendicant is an interesting word, which also means a beggar. The Latin word menda means a cripple, and which is why there is the word amend. To the opposite of menda is amend, to correct somebody's disability. So mendicant would then be a beggar who's got disability, people who don't have hands or legs and who therefore cannot earn their livelihood and who therefore have to ask for alms from people. And then lastly, the word tramp. If you have seen Charlie Chaplin movies, you would see that there's Charlie the Tramp. There are often posters depicting him as that because he played the character of a tramp. So it comes from the verb tramp. You can understand it with the other verb trample also, to trample upon something. And so the idea is somebody who trampled upon the earth, who was a vagrant, who was a vagabond, wanderer, who did not have a stable house or a job, and therefore they would have to ask for alms from other people. And therefore this synonym. And so these are 5 synonyms. Hope you'll remember them: beggar, hustler, destitute, mendicant, tramp. All right, let's go to the story now. The idea of a short story and the short story of an idea. So we have discussed these ideas in the previous 2 lessons that we did, especially the last leaf where we discussed in detail what the ideas of a short story are. But once again, a short story literally is short. It's not a novel. It does not turn into 300 pages or 1,000 pages to be able to explore characters, scenery, setting, plot, etc. in great detail. A short story is short, can range between a page to several pages, 30 odd pages. But because it's short, it has to be concise, it has to explore one particular angle of something, one particular facet or an episode from somebody's life. This is called slice of life. Or it explores a certain idea, which we see aplenty in Chekhov. We've already discussed the bet, where the idea of isolation and money was explored. And here the idea of empathy and begging is explored. And so a short story will always be concise, exploring one particular facet. It need not be an idea in particular, but different kinds of themes that can be explored. On the other hand, the short story of an idea, trying to theorize this, explores one particular theme. Like in this story, the idea of begging and the idea of empathy and social structures that create begging. What creates the idea of beggary? Why are there beggars? Are explored. So it's a very powerful story exploring one particular idea. All right, let's get into the story. There are only 3 characters, and so the idea of concision fits in very much. There's Sergei, Olga, and Lushkov. Sergei is a well-to-do man with a big house. Olga is his housemaid, and Lushkov is the beggar who he encounters. Though Lushkov is the protagonist, really. He's the hero. But why is Lushkov's name at the end in this presentation? Lushkov's name is at the end because Lushkov's name is at the end even in the story. Sergei calls him a beggar. He does not ask his name until he has interacted with him 10 times. And this is a reflection. We need to think about people who provide a service, people who are poor. You do not know their names. You know them by their faces, but you do not know their names. So it is... and this also, a short story explores these kind of nuances, these kind of finer points. by structurally placing Lushkov's name much, much later in the short story. Okay. So now into the plot of the story. The plot is very simple. There's a beggar who lies, who tells all kinds of lies to Sergei when he comes asking for alms. He's also an alcoholic. He has a drinking problem. He's young, but he has got a drinking problem, which is why he's unable to earn his living. Sergei puts him on the journey of reform, and eventually Lushkov is reformed. That is roughly the structure of the plot. Now let's get into the story itself. So Lushkov, who we do not know, so let's call him the beggar. He'll be known as Lushkov later. The beggar comes to Sergei on the street and asks him for money. He supplicates to him, saying, "For 8 years I was a village school teacher, and then I lost my place through intrigues, and I fell victim to calumny." The interesting words over here, intrigues and calumny. Calumny means when you slander someone, abuse someone, and intrigue is the petty politics that happens at the workplace, in particular this sentence. And so he was a school teacher, but because of the politics at school, and they told lies about him, they spread slander about him, and which is why he lost his job, and so he's forced to beg. This is what he says. However, Sergei catches him. He says that a week before I met you, and you declared that you were a student, and now you're saying you were a school teacher. So obviously you are lying, you are breaching trust, and you're asking money without telling the truth. You're basically a lazy man. And so Lushkov is caught and broken, and he does not know what to say, but eventually he admits the truth, and he tells that he was a choir singer in a church, but because he had a drinking problem, because he was forever drunk on alcohol, he was thrown out of the church. And now that was the only talent he had, to sing, and he has an alcohol problem, because of which he is unable to earn his living, which is why he's asking for money. So he's a school teacher, a student, a choir singer. Sergei takes him home and gives him wood to cut. But this man, even though he's young, is so degenerated with his alcoholism that he would not be able to cut wood. He almost starts crying, but because of shame of having been caught telling lie, and pride, being a former singer, and also the pride of saying that he would work for his livelihood, he agrees to it and sits all day, and eventually the wood is cut and brought to Sergei, who thinks he's achieved the process of reform on day one. And so he's called whenever there's need to cut the wood, once in a month. And Olga, the housemaid, takes him to the barn where he cuts the wood, and he gets a few rubles, 20 rubles. So kopecks. He gets 24 kopecks. So the relation between ruble and kopek is the same between rupee and paisa. 100 paisa make 1 rupee, 100 kopecks make 1 ruble in the Russian system. So thereafter, when the wood is cut a few times, and there's no more wood to cut, Sergei gives him other jobs like shoveling snow. So of course Russia is a very cold place, snows there all time, so you have to shovel with the snow. Cleaning dust, cleaning up the house, and then eventually gives him the job to copy a letter. Of course, there were no photocopiers or scanners in the 1890s, and the method to copy was to copy by hand. And so you see, there's a very interesting shift in the kind of jobs that the beggar does. He starts the wood cutter, and then shoveler, dust cleaner, to copier. So the physical labor is reducing with time as the trust of Sergei grows more and more, and he's being given lighter job, lighter physical labor, and eventually mental labor in terms of copying minimal physical labor. And this also structurally shows how mental labor is valued much more in our societies than physical labor, which is a point to think about as to why is it so. As for the beggar himself, wood cutting was the most difficult job to do. And eventually, he also gets more money than he was getting as a woodcutter. So these are finer points which we must keep thinking about while discussing the story. Now, after he copies the letter for Sergei, uh, Lushkov vanishes. And this is the point when Sergei also asks him his name, and he says it's Lushkov. Lushkov vanishes and does not come back for a long time. And eventually, Sergei finds him a couple of years later in front of a theater. They both have come to see a play. And Sergei is surprised. He immediately recognizes Lushkov, and he is surprised to see that a beggar has come to watch a play at the theater. And he asks him how he's doing, and he says he's doing very fine. He's got a nice job. He gets 30 rubles a month, which is quite a lot in the 1890s, sufficient to live a decent life. And so Sergei is very proud of himself, and he thinks to himself that he did a great job by pushing this beggar, putting him on the path of reform, and now he's reformed. And so Sergei says, I quote, and this is on your screen as well, I gave you a push along the right path, you know. Do you remember what a roasting I gave you, eh? I nearly had you sinking in the ground at my feet that day. Thank you, old man, for not forgetting my words. And so Sergei is proud of himself, and he says as much, that if I had not given you that rappings, the word here used is roasting, which is an informal slang word which means scolding, still used. I nearly had you sinking into the ground at the feet that day. And so he's telling the truth, that he was weak, drunk, and was not quite capable of chopping the wood, and so he was almost at his feet on the day that they met. And eventually he says, thank you, old man, for not forgetting my words. So what Sergei is thinking about is more about the words that he said and his role in reforming the beggar than the reform of the beggar itself. So there is some vanity in all of us, where we tend to think of ourselves as the centerpiece of the story. So here comes the twist in the tale. Anton Chekhov is very famous for the twist in the tale, which is that the end that you expect is not the end that is of a short story, as we discussed in the case of the bet last time. So I'll quickly summarize the plot of the bet, and then we'll compare it with this very quickly as well. So in the bet, there's a bet between a rich middle-aged banker and a young man about staying in isolation and confinement. The young man accepts the challenge to live for 20 years inside a little room, and if he runs away even one day before 20 years, he would not get the money that has been promised by the rich man. 20 years he lives in that room, struggles with his own mind, struggles with books, and eventually he leaves after 19 years and 364 days, one day before the contract ends, because he does not believe in money, that any amount of money cannot compensate for the last 20 years. So that is the sudden twist. The story is progressing smoothly, where you think that eventually either the man will get out or the old man will murder him, but eventually he just leaves of his own volition. So this is the kind of twist in the tale that Chekhov provides. What happens here then? Lushkov says, in reply to Sergei saying that I put you on the path to reform and you should remember that day, Lushkov says, you spoke finely then, and I shall be indebted to you to my dying day. But strictly speaking, it was your cook, Olga, who saved me. This is the twist in the tale, that you do not get the expected ending. The housemaid, who does not seem to have much of a role in the story, except that she tells Lushkov what to do, suddenly becomes the heroine of the story. It was Olga who saved me. He goes on to say, I cannot tell you how much misery she suffered, how many tears she shed for my sake, but the chief thing was she used to chop the wood for me. And so suddenly the story has entirely changed. This young man drunken, alcoholic young man did not chop the wood. He was not capable of it. He was too degenerated by alcohol to do it. And so this housemaid, she felt miserable at the misery of a fellow poor man. She cursed him, she abused him, she said he'll die, that he does not deserve to live. But all this was out of concern and love, and eventually, after cursing him, she would go and chop the wood for him. So the deep empathy she had for a fellow sufferer, for a fellow poor man, is what reformed him. That he could not take the suffering of that woman and her concern, her deep empathy, her concern for him, moved him so much that he got reformed and he stopped drinking or started drinking less. That is not mentioned over here, but he became capable of work. It is her kindness, her generosity, her selfless help to him, her selfless devotion to the cause of helping a poor man is what reformed him. It made him realize, it made him feel guilty, and he slowly reformed himself because he saw that somebody else is so self-sacrificing. Why couldn't he take a few steps? And so this is the point of the story. This is what we need to think about this story. That it is not merely by throwing coins at somebody that you can reform them, which is what Sergi was doing. He called him to his house, gave him some work, but Sergi had no empathy. He was thinking of himself as the hero, that he's helped a poor man, and that was Sergi's thing. Whereas Olga had deep sympathy, deep empathy for him, and she also did physical labor for another man, which is not what Sergi would have done. And that induced reform in Lushkov. So that is very important, that merely monetary charity or merely an act of help may not bail somebody out of a situation. That we need to understand the context, the psychology, how we can help someone. So we may do something at our end and say, oh, he did not get reformed. Let's say Sergi had given him the job of wood cutting. He would not have been able to do it. And Sergi would have gone and said, oh, these beggars, you know their lot. They would never reform. Olga showed it otherwise, that it can be done in a different way. So we need to understand the particular context of a person, what their problem is, and how it can be solved. Olga probably did not think about any of this, but merely the generosity of her heart and the deep love she had for humanity, for human, and the concern about human suffering reformed him. The other thing that we need to deeply think about is the structures that create begging. Why is it that there are people who beg in our society? Why are they economically deprived? Why cannot the state provide them support? Let's say in Lushkov's case, it would be support with the problem of alcoholism. The people who are crippled, how have they been crippled? What happened? There are all kinds of mafias operating in this business. That also happens. Or it may have happened accidentally. But are those issues addressed, or do we just see a beggar at a street corner or at a red light or traffic light, and we just get used to it, we ignore it, we do not think about it? These are points to really ponder about the structures of our society, and that it needs to be reformed with individual efforts as well as with policy efforts from above. Okay. So Chekhov, and this is a picture of Anton Chekhov with the great Russian writer Tolstoy. They were working at the same time. Tolstoy much older than him. A little about Anton Chekhov, as we've already discussed. He lived for a very short duration, just 44 years, and gave us a lot of creative work. So he is one of the three most important playwrights of this generation. He wrote short stories as a vocation to begin with. And one of the things that he says is that the role of a writer is to ask questions, not to answer them. When it was alleged that he does not give enough moral message, And so this story is very important, and so other stories of Chekhov, like the bed also that I mentioned, where it is important for a writer to put questions to the reader, to challenge the reader rather than just tell the reader. It's much more challenging when the message is, or the question is put to the reader instead of just giving a message that we should have empathy with beggars, for example. Chekhov's father was director of the parish of a parish choir, and he sang in the choir too. So always you can see a little autobiographical element in Chekhov as well. Him singing in the choir, and the beggar also sang in the choir. And for him, his father was a model of hypocrisy and got his soul from his mother, which you will also see reflected in a lot of writers like Franz Kafka. Another interesting trivia about Anton Chekhov is that he was a physician, a qualified doctor. Who are the other qualified doctors that we know of? Palash Sen, the musician of Euphoria. The doctors who can also be artists. Taslima Nasreen was also a writer, a famous writer, wrote the novel Lajja. Che Guevara, the revolutionary, the Argentinian revolutionary, who, amongst other things, wrote the Motorcycle Diaries, which was made into this blockbuster movie with Gael Garcia Bernal. Another comparable story about beggars is Model Millionaire by Oscar Wilde, which also you must read. It's a very beautiful story where there is this young guy engaged with a young girl, but he does not have money enough to marry her. So he just hangs around. He's friends with an artist called Alan Trevor, and goes to him. Alan is painting a portrait of an old wizened tramp. If we go back to that word tramp, in a tattered suit, and so a beggar is posing as a model, and the young man feels pity. And when Alan is gone for lunch, he puts a couple of coins in the beggar's hat. And the beggar keeps chuckling. It so turns out that the beggar is one of the top businessmen, and he wants to be painted as a beggar. And he's moved by the gesture of the young man, and he gives him £10,000 to get him married. And so Alan says millionaire models are rare enough, but by Jove, model millionaires are rarer still. It's a very good pun where the millionaire is a model for the society of having empathy for young people, concern for them. There's another story by Guy de Maupassant, which is also called The Beggar. This is about mendicant, the word that we heard, where a beggar is crippled. So there's a beggar who got crippled, and he lives in 3 villages, and everybody ignores him, spits at him, abuse him, but he cannot go out of those 3 villages. That is the world that he knows. And at one point of time, nobody gives him any food, and eventually he collapses. He's near death when he sees chicken passing by, and he grabs the chicken, kills it to eat it, and then it turns out that the chicken is the property of a farmer. The farmer comes to beat him up. The police come. The police take him to the jail, and he does not get food even that day. And the next day, he's dead. It's not a story with a twist and a tail, but with a linear progression, with you expecting that this would probably happen or not happen, that somebody would bail him out of the situation. But these stories, Chekhov's story and Guy de Maupassant's story, give us, make us question ourselves much more than tell us about the beggars themselves. That is something that we need to think about. A couple of quotes before we close this. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Like we've discussed earlier, that merely flinging a coin, merely charity does not help. That we need to look at why the society is such and how to work towards its reform. This is by Martin Luther King Jr., who's one of the most famous world leaders of the 20th century, who fought for the civil rights movement for the black people in America in 1963. I know that a man who shows me his wealth is like the beggar who shows me his poverty. They are both looking for alms from me, the rich man for the alms of my envy, the poor man for the alms of my guilt. Ben Hecht. And this fits in very much in this story, that Sergei, who is showing his wealth and is confident that he's the one who put Lushkov on the way to reform, is also like a beggar who's looking for alms of envy, that people poorer than him should be jealous of him, and the poor man for the alms of my guilt. And the poor man asks for alms, and we feel guilty about it. And eventually, Mark Twain's brilliant quote: "We are all beggars, each in his own way. We are all begging for something or the other, for success, for health, for a job, for marks, whatever." And there's this very beautiful song by Leonard Cohen which says, "Please don't pass me by, for I am blind, but you can see." So we are all blind in some ways or the other, and there are other people who can see. And so we are all begging for something or the other, each in his own way. So this is here we'll end this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.